following program is brought to you by the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at University of Maryland's Robert H. Smith School of Business. Welcome to the Ink Tank. Stay with us to get the inside scoop about technologies that could disrupt and challenge the way you do business.
Hello, I'm Christina Elson, and on this edition of the Ink Tank, we'll speak with Jack Bobo, the CEO of Futurity, a food industry consulting firm. We'll discuss global trends in agriculture, consumer perception of synthetic biology, and innovating trends that could be the key to feeding the planet. Jack, it's so great to have you here in the Ink Tank. So let's just jump right into it because we have a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to talk about food and your role as a food evangelist and some of the amazing trends that you've been seeing in the food industry. But let's frame things a little bit because we want to help people understand where we're going to position the conversation. So we definitely know that in this realm of food, particularly with synthetic biology, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of ways that we as humans can impact the planet at a really global scale. And as you've pointed out, in the next 30 years, there's going to be a real need for us to get our food right? So let's talk about how we can do that and why the next 30 years is so critical and what is the role of technology and what are these different technologies that we're talking about that are going to help us do that. So give me your thoughts on this 30-year, like why these next 30 years?
Right. So if you look at agriculture today, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is already being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's nothing bigger than agriculture. If we were to talk about water, 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture, more than anything else. If we were talking climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come directly from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. So there's just nothing bigger than agriculture. And that's today. So that's our baseline. But over the next 30 years, we're going to add 2 or 3 billion people to the planet. But they're also going to be making more money. They're going to be more affluent. And so they're going to need about 100% more protein by 2050. So we need to double the amount of food that we're producing. So by some estimates, we need to produce as much food in the next 30 or 40 years as were produced in 10,000 years of human civilization. Now that's a challenge.
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, it's amazing, you know, as an anthropologist, having studied sort of the decline and fall of ancient civilizations, a lot of it did have to do with the climate, agriculture, ability to leverage technology to produce food appropriate for the level of urbanization and growth, population growth. But you and I are on the same page that we're not talking about the population bomb that humans are going to eat themselves out of, eat the planet, and
Right.
we're just gonna. We want to make sure that people aren't going to bed hungry, but what we really need is just to get to an equilibrium, and that is possible. And it's not about reducing the number, reducing the population. It's just about getting to the right equilibrium. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of population, the rate of population growth peaked in 1966, the year I was born. And so it's been growing slower and slower every year since then. And so it's going to max out at, maybe 8, 9, 10 billion people. But after that, it levels off and then declines. So we don't have to produce more and more food forever. We just have this one little window in which we need to produce it faster than we've ever done before. And so if we can get to 2050 without cutting down our forests and draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers, in many ways, we're good forever. So this is a challenge. The next 30 years is the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they are, but they're also the most important 30 years there will ever be. And so that's a really hopeful message.
Yeah. So because it's not just about getting agriculture right, it's about balancing agriculture with our impact on the planet. So when we see things like the scale of deforestation and forest fires in the Amazon, that's a real concern, right? That's not helping us get our balance right. So let's talk a little bit about technology in helping us get this balance right, because we have a whole range of things that are going on, everything from synthetic biology to blockchain to artificial intelligence. And all of this is being applied in the food industry in different ways. So let's just start with the food itself. Like, what is going on in your view with producing food that's healthy? Where is the struggle and the challenge there? We have these issues of perceptions of food. We have issues of innovations in food. People get excited about innovation, but it's also innovation also can be scary. So give me your thoughts in that area.
Yeah, so we're at a really interesting moment in history in terms of food. For 10,000 years, all we cared about was producing more food. And within the last 10, 20, 30 years, we're now focused not just on feeding the world, but nourishing the world. So we're making this transition, and that's why it's somewhat challenging, because while we have nearly 1 billion people who are underfed, we have a couple billion people who are arguably overfed or still not nourished in the right way. And so we need to produce food in a way that's very different than when you're just trying to keep people fed. And so there are an explosion in the types of food that are being produced and the ways that food is being produced. So I think we're not just going to be producing food better than we were before in terms of productivity of the cow and the chicken and the corn, but we're also going to be producing it through plant-based foods. We're going to be producing it through fermentation, where we produce dairy proteins through fermentation and other things. So we're at this exciting moment where there's going to be an explosion of technologies that are going to bring food to our dinner plate in ways that we probably never imagined.
One of those areas that's really critical that you mentioned earlier is protein, right? So let's talk a little bit just about protein, because there is so much going on with technology and helping people get protein that makes them healthy and be able to grow well and live a full adult life. So why is that such a area for innovation?
Well, it's an area for a couple of reasons. One, consumers are just really interested in protein right now. It's a food trend that people are trying to get more protein in their diet, even though most people in Western countries get perfectly adequate amount of protein. But for many parts of the world, they actually need a lot more protein. So it's not something that is easily accessible. But as they become more affluent, they're able to afford it. And so that demand and drive is going to continue to increase faster than population growth. So we're going to need to be able to meet that demand. But that's also created some challenges that some that are advocating vegan lifestyle or vegetarian are arguing that, their goal is to drive the livestock producer or the cattle rancher out of business. And that might get you some market share, but it also creates pushback from different parts of the economy. And there's also just the fact that doubling the amount of protein, well, that's a really big challenge. And we're probably not going to do it with just one solution. And so we need to find a way of de-escalating that tension in our food supply so that everybody can get about the business of saving the planet in their own way.
Yeah, so that's really important. You're saying that there's such a growing market that there is room for many, many different approaches and many different preferences in a way. And that gets into, well, is my preference more ethical than your preference? And how am I going to leverage policy and government so that my preference overrides your preference? And, these are they get very convoluted. But there is also a question of trust. And you talk to a lot of people, and you are very interested in this question of trust in food. And so when we're talking about some of these technologies like, GMOs, CRISPR, things that are directly impacting food, what happens there? It's one thing to say, like, I want to lead a vegan lifestyle. That may or may not involve me having to deal with technology or integrate technology. I could ideally just become a Luddite and grow everything on my farm, if I want to.
Right.
I mean, but when you want to approach it a different way, people do want to understand and figure out how they can think about and trust different technology. So Tell me what you think people need to understand or how to approach that learning opportunity.
Yeah, so innovation is challenging in many ways because when we think about innovation, sometimes people say that large food companies are not very good at innovating, and there are reasons for that. They're large, they're slow, they're risk averse, and they're indecisive. So there are lots of reasons why that could be true. But for me, in many ways, I don't think that's really what's happening. I think that innovation is about change. Change is scary. If I'm going to try something new, I want to know I trust the person who's selling it to me. And if you look at a startup, well, I can know whether or not I share the values of the founder of a startup. But can I know if I share the values of a company with 55,000 employees? Do they all share my values? And so that's where innovation can be more challenging for those organizations to bring to market because they don't have that same trust. And I can give you an example. So imagine for a moment that Monsanto had created the Impossible Burger. What would have happened?
Yeah, I wonder.
Well, yeah, I think we all know it would have failed. And the newspapers, though, would have all said, what were they thinking? Nobody in the world will ever eat a GMO burger. But of course, that wasn't true. The problem, everybody would have agreed on what had happened, and everybody would have been wrong. It would have failed because a large company was trying to sell that to them, and people didn't believe that their values were aligned with that company. So Impossible Foods, of course, brings that same product to market. No pushback or very little pushback on the fact that they're using genetically engineered yeast to produce the heme that gives it its bloody flavor. But that's also why the day they arrived in 18,000 Burger Kings, they were no longer seen as that same small startup. And the next day, people started asking, hey, isn't this ultra-processed? Well, it was ultra-processed when it was in Founding Farmers as well, but nobody cared about that because it was twice as expensive as the regular burger. But the day that the masses could access this same product, we started asking questions that we just didn't ask before. And so we need to recognize that not just who do we trust depends a little bit on who you are, but also that can change over time. But if we don't find a way of addressing that challenge, then everything will change.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because Americans are curious people. They love entrepreneurs, but they don't love big business, right? So we do have this weird sort of pattern where we root for the small entrepreneur. We don't want to look too carefully always at what they're doing, and that's probably fine. We want to let the market sort of sort some of this out clearly. But we also, when these companies get picked up by these big, I think a lot of these big companies have just learned, like, let's just let this sort of bubble up, and then we're just going to buy it. And that's certainly one way to do things. I'm not sure if that's best for, market competition, free market competition, but it is certainly a pattern that seemed to develop in America.
Well, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's no place they despise change more than the food they eat, because food is what brings us together with friends and family. And if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But getting to the point of whether or not big companies can innovate, I'm confident that they can. I visited many of these big companies, and they're doing amazing innovation. I think the question is how you talk about it. So authenticity, I think we know, is critically important to consumers today. And one of the ways you relate authenticity is through storytelling. Now, if you're a small startup, the story that you tell is the story of the founders and the values they hold. But if you're a large brand, the story you tell is about nostalgia and retro chic. And I think a great example of that is in 1985, when New Coke came out, I can tell you I was not going to drink it. But earlier this year, when Stranger Things started a crossover with Coca-Cola and they started talking about New Coke, and Coca-Cola brought out a certain number of those New Coke cans, people like me were like scrambling, trying to hey, I want to try that. Right? Because it went from being innovative, which is off-brand for Coca-Cola, to being nostalgic, which is absolutely where Coca-Cola wants to be. So instead of them talking about we just innovated and brought a new product to market, they should talk about we're a company with a history of bringing amazing flavors to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what innovation is, but how you communicate it is totally on brand for them.
So the idea of building trust through letting people understand what your story is, how you're going to make their lives better, who are the people that work for you, and why are they so passionate about what they do, really is part of that story.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the incumbents in the food industry, there's actually a lot of angst. So I think that technology is changing so quickly that they're not quite sure where it's going. And consumer attitudes seem to be changing really quickly, and they don't know how to get ahead of those trends. And so I think for the established food companies, there is a lot of angst, and that includes the different associations and farm groups and others. And so I think part of what needs to happen is to help them to understand what their place in the order is and how they can get ahead of those trends. Now, some of them really haven't done very much to expand their product lineup in decades. And what I would say is that people aren't, I'll just use dairy as an example. People aren't choosing not to drink dairy mostly because they don't like milk, huge penetration in almost every household. What they're doing is that they're looking around and they want to try something new. And so they look and they see, oh, I'm going to try coconut water. I'm going to try almond milk. I'm going to try these things. Not so much because they don't like milk, but because they just want to try something new. And, that's a trend that started back in the 1980s and will only become, greater over time. And so I think the opportunity for organizations like that is to think, okay, well, how can I bring new, delightful products to market if I'm in the dairy industry? And I think one can take a page from the playbook of some of these startups and say, hey, well, there are hundreds of different proteins in dairy that could be amazingly nutritious and healthy. Why don't we start, fractionating it and turning it into a dozen different products and bringing those to markets with small startups, not with big companies that it's off brand for them to try to be innovating in that way. But it could be, perfectly good for entrepreneurs to be doing that. So I think that, we haven't even really explored all of the opportunities in those incumbent industries to be more competitive and, excite the consumer in the same way that some of these new alternatives have.
Yeah, so things like dairy, almond milk, which of course I don't think the dairy industry wants anyone to call dairy, but the real range of milk, that's available. Of course, all of these have their impact environmentally, and their environmental impact that is, can become part of the debate and discussion. But putting that aside, I think the point of this, humans are, people just like to look for something novel, different, interesting, something that suits. I mean, there's so much talk of individual, what is best for you as an individual? Like, how can you chart your food plan? What do you need to eat to be the optimal best person that, Jack can be? This much protein, this much this, it's so much, it's so much easier to do that nowadays because we do have technologies that we can analyze ourselves at such a micro level in a lot of ways. And at the same time, technologies are helping companies think about how to create very niche products that, as you said, maybe weren't possible before because it was too expensive to engineer certain kinds of plants or animals. So how does that wind up? Where does that wind up meeting? Because you pointed out that organic used to be something special and unique and something that could command a higher price point. But that's shifting a little bit, and people are looking for craft and, all these other things. So how is that going to be a part of what's happening these next 30 years? Because some of that is very local. Some of it maybe isn't. It could be global. I mean, I can go search for the most unique coffee in the world. I mean, right. So but that's a big thing.
Yeah. So, when I look back at the Amazon purchase of Whole Foods in many ways is the beginning of the end of the organic food movement. Not because organic is going to go away, it's going to continue to grow, but it democratized it. It commoditized it. And the last thing that people want who are driving food trends, who have really unlimited money to buy whatever they want, is to buy a commodity. And so it changed the nature of the consumer's relationship to organic. And over the last couple of years, its growth rate has slowed. And as a result of that, some of the producers are looking at regenerative agriculture, agroecology, other things to be able to demonstrate that, it is still special, it is still exclusive, and it has something to offer, whether that's artisanal or local or other things. So I think that there's a recognition that it doesn't mean the same thing that it meant in the future or in the past. But if you look around what we see today and what is going forward, I think that, plant-based food is the new organic. It's the thing that people have latched on to as cool and hip and new and unique. But what I think is interesting is that the trend with plant-based is going to move much more quickly than it did with organic. It took 50 years to get to 4% of American ag being organic. How long is it going to take before every grocery store has 1,000 plant-based products on the market? Maybe a year or two. 3 max. And so a year from now, nobody will get a headline because they're introducing a new plant-based burger or chicken nugget or meatball. So there's only this narrow window over the next year at which anybody can bring a product to market and actually get, some lines of print because it's plant-based. So soon, if not, very soon, they're going to have to deliver on taste, price, quality, something else that's going to define why it's special. And so I think that when people talk about 25% growth in plant-based for the next, 10 or 20 years, I think they're missing the fact that its success will then begin to push back against it because the people that, want the Impossible Burger today, once it's in every restaurant, it just won't matter anymore in the same way, which is, part of the success of the companies that are doing it. But it also means that you just can't have those same growth rates forever.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but that gets us to a really interesting topic, which are these trends. And one of the things that you do is you look for these sort of trends that are sort of a little bit below the sight line, right? And what are those, or what are a couple things that you could share with us right now?
Sure. So I think it's important to think about the difference between trends and fads. And so a fad is something like gluten-free because it doesn't cut across other sectors. Whereas transparency is a trend because it's happening in computers, it's happening in, our cars and our transportation and all sorts of things in our daily lives. So trends are things that cut across sectors. And transparency, I think, is a good one to think about because right now everybody's talking transparency, critically important. Everybody has to do it. And I think that's true. But I like to compare transparency today to food safety 100 years ago. 100 years ago, people really cared about food safety. Today, our food has become so safe that people don't have to think about it until it's not there. So if transparency continues to grow as a trend, eventually it becomes irrelevant. 20 or 30 years from now, you're not going to be able to make a headline by saying, oh, we're the most transparent company ever, because everybody will assume everybody is 100% transparent.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. You'll only be punished by the economy for not being transparent. Just like today, you can only be punished for a failure in food safety. You can't get any credit by giving safe food.
That's very true. Yeah.
And so, that's understanding that means that it's only a certain period of time in which companies can jump on the transparency bandwagon to get any recognition from the public. Once it starts to peak, then you're just going to get punished for not being there. And so, that's a way of seeing that transparency trend in a slightly different light. I talked about the trend related to big food versus small, and that we trust small organizations, but as soon as they become big, then we start asking different questions. I think that, those are things that people don't necessarily recognize when you're a small company. You think, oh, we're special, but, you may not be special for the reason you think you're special. You think, well, people trust us because we share their values, as opposed to they trust us because we're at a certain point in our growth cycle and that we'll need to do new things in order to continue to be trustworthy as we scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this idea of trend spotting has become very important in terms of, there are companies now that have trend spotters, right? I mean, they have for a while, but even thinking about trying to figure out where you are in the trend. And then it's sort of mutually reinforcing. So to your point with transparency, that's where something like blockchain comes in. So if you feel that transparency may be an important trend for your company to capture part of that desire, value, or perception that's important for your customer, then is blockchain something that you can leverage to help you communicate your goal of wanting to be a transparent company? So that gets very interesting.
Yeah. So another way of breaking down trends, though, is to look at something that everybody's talking about, because everybody's talking about it's probably not interesting. You're already 5 or 10 years late. But when you think about something like blockchain, well, blockchain is really a combination of other trends. It's massively distributed computing, it's artificial intelligence and algorithms, and it's processing power in order to do these things. So once you start doing that, you can break down trends and you can put them back together in different ways. And so artificial intelligence is one that I mentioned. Well, artificial intelligence plus a physical embodiment is a robot. And so you start to think of things in slightly different ways. Right now we all think about robotics and what are its implications in industry. But one of the things about robotics is that it can bring down production costs. Well, if it brings down production costs, it's mostly through labor. And today we're importing products from Asia and other places because labor is cheaper. Well, robotics could mean that we import all of that manufacturing because it doesn't need to be in Asia anymore. So the biggest impact of robotics might be in bringing jobs back to the United States. Now, those are different jobs than the labor jobs that went out, but as cost for labor go down, transportation cost becomes a bigger and bigger piece of the cost of your product. And so we start thinking about things in a way that maybe we didn't think about it before.
Yeah, it puts a different twist on sort of the local food movement, local farm to table or whatever, because there's an element to that's very anti-technology, but the way you're phrasing it is really that technology can facilitate that in a much better way, a much more affordable way, and actually probably a way that impacts the environment less than if we just went back to growing food the way we did in the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be able to do that because, we don't have the manual labor anymore to be able to do that. So without some technologies, we're not going to be able to achieve the goals we have. And so for me, it's not about right or wrong, good or bad. It's about choices and consequences. And for me, there's a role for each of these technologies in our food supply. Some people look at GMOs versus organic or conventional agriculture, and I just see them as part of a continuum. And today, if you're an organic farmer, you may be using big data and large combines and all these things on your farm to make you a better farmer, but they were all created for big industrial farmers. They weren't created for you, but you benefit from the existence of those technologies and you do a better job. On the other hand, if you're a big industrial farmer today, you may be using things like cover crops, which you plant between growing season to maintain the soil and maybe add some nutrients back to it. But you're doing that because some organic farmer believed in her heart it was the right thing to do. Big data came along and proved her right.
Yeah.
And so that transfer of knowledge from the organic farm to the industrial farming system allows the impact to be felt far faster than expanding organic farming itself. And so it becomes a test bed for our food system, and its impact is mostly by sending those ideas out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit about you, because you have a very interesting background, and it's always great to learn a little bit about how people, you don't really have like a conventional job, so so what is your education background? Like, what is your sort of path that you followed and why? And tell us about.
Yeah, well, it was definitely the road less taken. Well, when I went to undergraduate at Indiana University, and I ended up with degrees in biology, chemistry, psychology. Then I went into the Peace Corps, where I was a science teacher in Central Africa, came back and got degrees in environmental science and law. So, I have 5 degrees. Well, my wife has the PhD in our family, so I'm more about quantity of degrees, and she's quality of degrees.
That's good. That's a good one.
Well, so then from there, I ended up working at the U.S. Department of State for 13 years in the Office of Global Food Policy. And I spent a few years covering Africa, food security, food trade, biotechnology, all of those things. Then I covered Asia, and then I worked on Europe. Then I was the chief of our biotechnology division, so I managed people that covered all of those regions of the world. Then my last few years, I gave up all my supervisory responsibilities. My only job was giving speeches. So I had kind of an unlimited travel budget, could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate to the public. And so it was a really interesting time for me because I stopped focusing so much on the science, because science tells us what we can do, but the public tells us what we should do. And I started reading about cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. I wanted to understand, why do people make the decisions they do? How do we come to believe what we believe, know what we know? And what does it take to change somebody's mind? So I really wanted to understand that. And it really changed how I present information and how I talk about it, and the importance of my building trust and rapport with my audience before I talk about things that might be somewhat challenging of their personal beliefs, so that, we can open the conversation.
We think in the past that science, you would lead with the science, right? So we're all used to the 1950s films where some scientist gets up there and says, today, rah, 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 rah. And now we're not so sure about that. There's a perception, or human perception is really interesting. It's a fascinating field, just visually, the way people see things and acquire knowledge, and also the way that we have ingrained bias and all sorts of other stuff. So, you're saying that a lot of what happens in the demand of the consumer and how that translates into policy and things that are affect and impact the markets and the way that markets work ultimately is coming from this very deep human perception issue, right? So, yeah.
So I always say that if you lead with science, you will lose with science. Science at the beginning of a conversation just polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree more. Now, that's very frustrating for those of us who love science. We want to talk about the science. But when science and your values are at odds, values always win. Because if I choose to ignore my values, I'm actually have to give up my cohort and my family because they all believe the same things that I do. And so that's very scary for people. So what we really need to do is, when we talk about science, first we need to build that trust and connect with people and let them know that we share their values. And then science can come along. And, we have family and friends who believe crazy things all the time, but we love them and we trust them. And so we don't think they're a bad person just because they're wrong. And so once you have that trust, you can have an honest conversation where we can agree, and we can agree to disagree without feeling that that person is somehow doing something, behind our backs or trying to undermine our health.
Yeah. It really is a tricky balance. I mean, you want to have substantive conversations about things that's not just all accusatory or inflammatory, or sort of trying to get the rise out of something. You want something behind it, but at the same time, you're right. If you just lead with the science and stick with the science, it doesn't speak to the needs or fears or concerns that people have about things like change. And what does this mean for me?
Well, and an example of that, and that's why I talk about choices and consequences. So in Europe, they have chosen more low productivity agriculture, fewer inputs, less fertilizer and things like that, keeping the farm smaller. All things that, we might think those sound like really great and wonderful things, that the farms might have a better ecology and all of that. But as a consequence, Europe can't produce enough animal feed to feed itself or its animals, so it imports 70% of its animal feed needs. And the country that sends the most feed to Europe is Brazil. So Europe has exported its agricultural footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet.
Yeah.
And so, that's their choice. They're choosing to protect the farms in Europe and the forest in Europe, but there's a cost of exporting it to the country that, with Indonesia, drive all of global deforestation. 2 countries are responsible for all of global deforestation. So that's a challenge. And so, when you point that out, then somebody could say, well, we don't want to import, our animal feed from Brazil anymore. We're going to stop that. It's like, well, then you have to decide, are you going to cut out 50% of your meat consumption or are you going to buy those soybeans from America or Argentina? So again, it's not about right or wrong, but whatever choice you make, there will be consequences to it. And so, you have to live with the consequences of your actions. So after I left the State Department, I went to a biotechnology company in Traxon as the head of communications and government affairs. And while the company's origins were trying to develop cures for cancer and other things that people are generally pretty happy with, it had also acquired a number of companies that were more consumer facing. And so that's why they wanted somebody who understood how to talk to the public. And things included the Arctic apple, a non-browning genetically engineered apple, majority shareholder in Aqua Bounty, which produces the genetically engineered salmon, Oxitec, which does genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Zika and other things. And so they were involved in a lot of complex things. And for me, one of the things that I would talk about are how do you explain technology? And that's a challenge. And so it's better to talk about the benefits for people. And that's why at that time, I always said that the Arctic apple was the most important GMO in the history of the world because it's the first GMO you would buy because it's a GMO rather than in spite of the fact it's a GMO, right?
Yeah.
And because if you can give somebody a product they want and love, all of these other concerns go out the window. If people love the Impossible Burger, then they won't care that it's made with GMOs or they won't care that it's processed if they love that product. And so that's really critical. And so about 5 or 6 months ago, I left Traxon and started my own consulting firm, Futurity. And part of what I wanted to do is to be able to work with small food tech startups and bigger brands to help them to understand what are those trends, how do you get ahead of a trend so you don't get run over by it, and how do we talk about things that de-escalates the tension in our food system so we can all get about the business of saving the planet.
Yeah, that's great. It's true. I mean, getting about the business of saving the planet is really where we need to be on so many levels. So the opportunities for getting about the business of saving the planet are, I assume there are many, but these are very confusing times for a lot of people who are either looking to maybe move into a new industry. They have a lot of great technical skills and they're thinking, wow, how can I apply these to something that I'm really passionate about or area I'm really passionate about? And, food is always one of those areas. Or someone who's in school and thinking like, okay, here I am, studying engineering or computer science or business or, whatever, communications. They're not really often being told like you should prepare for a career in the food industry. You know what I mean? So how do people figure this stuff out? I mean, what do you see as opportunities and what are ways that people can learn more about opportunities?
Well, the first thing I would say, it's a generic point about, when you're looking for a job, that, people that do engineering tend to go to engineering firms. And I would say that's the last place you want to go. Because, I studied environmental science and I wanted to go to EPA. Well, I'm competing with thousands of people to be the lowest person at an organization. And instead, I ended up at the State Department doing food. So I was immediately an expert, even though I knew nothing about food. Whereas if I'd gone to U.S. Department of Agriculture, again, I would have been the lowest person of, 1 million people. And so what I tell people is find the two things you're passionate about. One may be what you've studied. But what's that other thing you just really love? And so if you're an artist, if you're an engineer, if you're a computer scientist, and you just love food, I would say that's the perfect sector for you to go for because they don't have a lot of artists, engineers, and computer science in that field. And so the day you start, you will be an expert in your field. And so there's just this great opportunity. I mean, for the first time in my life, food is sexy and it's cool and it's exciting. And it's all the way from what's happening, not just on the farm anymore, but the soil below the farm, to what's happening on our dinner plate. Innovation is happening everywhere in between. And so it's an exciting time for anybody who can, touch the sector.
So there's lots of opportunity in industry and in the innovation is happening a lot. And right now we are trying to let some of that in. Do you feel that we're trying to let some of that innovation happen so it creates opportunities for individuals, for employment, for entrepreneurship, for other things? Is that a general sense that you're getting? We're not overly sort of trying to get in there and,
No, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that there are funds and resources that are pouring into the sector looking for great ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that makes it very exciting. It's not just the people that are in food that, feel like it's really important, but it's people from the outside that are trying to figure out, well, how can I get in?
Jack, it's been really great to have you here and to think about what's going on with food in the next 30 years and all the opportunities and possibilities that there are for us to, as you said, get it right. So I think we will encourage people to get in there, to get passionate about it, and help get it right.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. We now have the ability to leverage technology to fundamentally shift how we interact with the earth. In the next 30 years, consumer perception about new trends in food technology will be critical to creating a diverse and balanced approach to feeding the planet. Thanks to Jack Bobo for talking with me today. Until next time, this is Christina Elson in the Ink Tank.
Subscribe to the Ink Tank on Spotify, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts. A special thank you to the Kauffman Foundation for their support. From the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, thank you for joining us in the Ink Tank.